What would you do if the biggest annoyance of your life became the one thing you didn't want to lose? Welcome to Happiness of Love, your daily dose of K-dramas. Get ready to fall in love with unforgettable stories. Can you tell us where are you listening from? Anna Lewis's coffee cup shook on the table. The floor vibrated, the ceiling vibrated, even her thoughts vibrated with the deafening beat coming from the wall next door. Boom, boom, boom. Like rhythmic thunder invading your silent refuge. She blinked several times in disbelief as the laptop screen shook slightly from the reverberation. A moment of silence gave hope that it was over. But then came the voice. A male voice. Powerful. Singing. High. Very loud. And completely out of tune. Anna jumped up, kicking the chair back. What the hell was going on in 503? For 5 years, she lived in that building without hearing a single noise from her neighbors. It was one of the reasons I paid absurd rent for a relatively small apartment, the absolute silence, the unshakable peace. But now, that peace was being brutally murdered by a lunatic with an invisible microphone. She marched up to the wall, caught her fingers on the edge of the door frame, and took a deep breath. Maybe it was an isolated moment. One slip. But, before she could convince herself to ignore it, the sound of a guitar appeared, accompanied by more screams, which were probably for himself, judging by the laughter right after. His left eye began to twitch. This couldn't continue. Before he knew it, he was banging on the door of 503 with enough force to sink the wood. The sound of the guitar stopped abruptly. Footsteps came towards the door, and then it opened, revealing a tall man in a baggy sweatshirt and messy hair, who blinked in surprise when he saw her. Hey! Anna crossed her arms. Can you please explain what is happening here? He scratched his head, confused. Was I playing? She pointed an accusing finger at the wall behind him. Playing? Playing? Were you rehearsing for a concert at the Seoul Stadium? Because the whole building can hear you. He laughed, an easy, relaxed laugh, as if he wasn't being threatened with death by his neighbor. Oh, my bad. I got excited. Anna felt a vein pulsate on her forehead. What do you mean oh, was it bad? He reached out to her. I'm John Moore. I just moved. She ignored his hand. Anna Lewis. Your new neighbor. The one who likes silence. John pulled his hand back and smiled, like this was hilarious. I understood. I'll try not to turn your apartment into a music festival. She stared at him for a moment, trying to decide if he was really going to do this or if it was just idle talk. Something about him irritated her deeply, perhaps his carefree manner, or the fact that he seemed amused by the situation. Excellent. I hope you accomplish this. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, she heard John mutter something to himself. Funny, people usually get more excited when they see me. She stopped. He turned slowly. What does that mean? John blinked, as if realizing he had said too much. Then he tilted his head and smiled. Nothing. Welcome to chaos, neighbor. Anna narrowed her eyes. There was something very suspicious about that man. But one thing was certain. His private hell had just begun. The sound began as a distant noise, a faint echo that filtered through the walls. But then, it grew. Waves of guitar chords mixed with a male voice, too enthusiastic to be considered just a casual workout. Anna Lewis squinted her eyes and looked at the clock next to the bed. 23 hours and 45 minutes. His body, exhausted after a full day of fighting writer's block, sank deeper into the sheets as his patience sank to an even deeper place. Over the past 7 days, his once peaceful and quiet life had turned into an acoustic nightmare. Since the arrival of John Moore, their neighbor from 503, the walls of their apartment had become fragile membranes that transmitted every note, every laugh, and even the sound of carefree footsteps across the wooden floor. But that night, the limit had been crossed. The beat of the music resonated inside her skull, as if it had been designed to torture her personally. He closed the notebook with a snap and threw the covers to the side. Her feet touched the cold floor as she pulled on a hoodie and marched out the door. The frustration in his chest bubbled with every step down the silent hallway, where the only disturbance came from a single source, damn apartment 503. When he reached John's door, he took a deep breath and knocked loudly. A second of silence. Then, footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there he was, wearing a loose black tank top and sweatpants, his hair messy like he'd just rolled out of bed or been in an impromptu music video. He held a guitar against his side and looked at her with an expression of pure surprise, his lips slightly curved, as if he already knew what she was going to say. Anna crossed her arms, feeling his gaze linger on her face for a moment too long. He blinked slowly before breaking into a smile, leaning against the doorframe as if he were posing for a photo shoot. He said he didn't expect a visit so late, and Anna felt her anger rise even more when she realized that he actually thought that was funny. He replied that it was not a visit, but a protest. He laughed, the kind of relaxed, carefree laugh that only made it all the more irritating, and asked if his music was so good that it would make the neighbor lose sleep. The muscle at the corner of Anna's jaw twitched. He wanted to respond that, in fact, his music was an attack on human rights, but he stopped himself. He just said that if he had any respect for the well-being of the people around him, then he should stop turning the apartment into a rehearsal studio at 11 at night. He tilted his head slightly to the side, his eyes shining with something she couldn't decipher, and said he had no idea she was so sensitive to sounds. Anna huffed in exasperation, saying that anyone with a working pair of ears would have the same reaction. John then smiled in a different, more provocative way, as if he was testing something. He asked her if she wanted to come in and choose a better song for him to play, because maybe the problem wasn't the noise, but the repertoire. Anna blinked in disbelief, feeling indignation mixed with fatigue weighing on her shoulders. Did he really believe this was some kind of game? It was then that she realized. The way he looked at her, his easy, confident smile, his relaxed posture, everything indicated that he truly believed she knew who he was. For him, this was a common scene, a chance meeting with yet another person who had recognized him and who would soon give in to his charm. Anna exhaled slowly, crossing her arms again before saying that she had no idea who he was and that, honestly, she didn't care. All I wanted was a night's sleep without the ceiling feeling like it was going to collapse from the noise. For a brief moment, something in John's expression changed. It was subtle, but Anna noticed the exact moment when surprise crossed her face, as if it were unexpected news. But he soon recovered, laughing lightly before raising his hands in surrender. He said that was fine, that he would make an effort to keep the music at an acceptable level and that, if she needed a formal apology, he could write a song in her honor. Anna rolled her eyes before saying that she preferred silence. He smiled, leaning forward slightly, as if considering saying something more, but in the end he just said goodnight before closing the door. Anna stood there for a moment, trying to understand what, exactly, bothered her so much about him. Maybe it was the easy way he dealt with everything, as if nothing really affected him. Or maybe it was the fact that, even though she was irritated, she couldn't deny that he was absurdly handsome, the kind that made sense to be on television or on magazine covers. But before his mind went too far along that line of thought, he shook his head and returned to his apartment, deciding that, with luck, that would be the end of the problem. She couldn't be more wrong. The next morning dawned strangely silent. Anna Lewis woke up with the unusual feeling that something was wrong, until she realized that, for the first time in a week, there was no music coming from the wall next door. No guitar, no off-key singing, no sound of impatient footsteps crossing apartment 503. It was as if John Moore had evaporated overnight, and that realization should have relieved her. But instead, a small uneasiness settled in his mind, a subtle discomfort that didn't make sense. Pushing the thought away, she got up, went through her morning routine with mechanical precision, and, after brewing a mug of strong coffee, sat at the table with her notebook open, determined to make up for lost time in her writing. However, he had barely typed the first sentence when a noise from the hallway interrupted his concentration. The sound was unmistakable. Quick steps, hurried whispers, the repetitive click of a camera shooting in sequence. Anna frowned and stood up, walking to the door cautiously. He peered through the peephole and saw a man wearing a cap and black jacket leaning against the hallway wall, holding a professional camera with a lens long enough to look like spy equipment. The photographer stared at the door of 503, his fingers restless on the shutter, like a predator patiently waiting for its prey. Anna felt a shiver run down her spine. Was your new neighbor being followed by paparazzi? Which meant he was, in fact, someone famous. An actor? A singer? A criminal on the run? Whatever the answer was, it wasn't her problem. She decided to ignore it and returned to her desk, determined to stay out of any trouble. But before he could sit down, a muffled sound came from his door, as if someone was desperately trying to open the doorknob. She froze. Another sound, more urgent. Then a whispered voice, hoarse and anxious from the other side of the wood, calling his name. Anna, open it quickly. She blinked, recognizing the voice instantly. He walked slowly to the door, hesitating for a moment before unlocking it. As soon as he turned the handle, John Moore practically threw himself into the apartment, slamming the door behind him and breathing deeply, as if he had just run a marathon. He wore a gray hoodie with the hood pulled over his head, and his eyes sparkled with a mix of relief and adrenaline. Anna crossed her arms, feeling her irritation growing faster than her curiosity. He asked what he thought he was doing, breaking into his apartment without warning. John, still panting, raised a hand for a second before stepping away from the door, peering cautiously through the peephole. He said that there was a paparazzi in the hallway and that, if he had left at that moment, his location would certainly have been discovered. Anna narrowed her eyes, trying to understand the gravity of the situation. She said it wasn't her problem if he had photographers chasing him and that he should just get out of there before she kicked him out. John turned to face her, as if he was just now realizing he was inside the apartment of someone who clearly didn't want his presence. He smiled slightly, a smile that seemed more like an attempt to convince her than a true gesture of amusement, and said he only needed 5 minutes at most. He promised that after that he would leave and never bother him again. She sighed, massaging her temples, already regretting opening the door. But before he could argue further, a loud noise echoed from the hallway. The insistent click of the camera, followed by the sound of 503's door opening and a male voice calling John Moore's name. Anna caught her breath at the same moment that John's eyes widened. The only logical explanation was that the photographer had seen the door to 502 open. John turned to Anna on impulse and, before she could react, grabbed her hand and pulled her close, lowering his voice as he said that if anyone knocked on that door, she needed to pretend they were friends. Anna opened her mouth to protest, but before any sound could escape, 3 firm knocks sounded on the door. She closed her eyes. This wasn't happening. John squeezed her hand lightly, and Anna opened her eyes only to find his eyes inches away. He whispered that he needed her to trust him just for a few minutes. Anna wanted to laugh at the irony. Trust him? At the noisy neighbor who had made his life a living hell the last few days? But then the voice from outside called again, asking if John was there. She exhaled slowly. If that meant getting rid of him faster, then so be it. He straightened his shoulders and unlocked the door, opening it with a calculated movement. The photographer looked at her with confusion for a moment before asking if she had seen John Moore entering her apartment. Anna raised an eyebrow, assuming a tone of disregard as she said that, as far as she knew, John was in his own apartment, sleeping, and that he was probably knocking on the wrong door. The man hesitated for a second, as if he didn't know whether to insist, but then he mumbled an apology and walked slowly down the hall. Anna waited until she was sure he was away before closing the door, turning on her heel to face John, who was watching her with an amused gleam in his eyes. He said he didn't know she was so convincing and that perhaps he should consider a career in theater. She snorted, saying that it was just an act of desperation and that he needed to leave her apartment immediately. But before John could take a step, a sharp, insistent sound made them both freeze. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He quickly pulled it out, and as soon as he looked at the screen, his expression changed. Anna frowned, watching his jaw twitch slightly before he let out a slow sigh and turned the device around for her to see. It was a notification from a gossip website. A photo of Anna peering out her door, with the headline highlighted in bold letters. John Moore has a new girlfriend? Former idol caught leaving mystery woman's apartment. Anna blinked. Then it blinked again. Then he said, very slowly, that it had to be a joke. John closed his eyes for a moment before looking at her with an expression that mixed guilt and resignation. He said maybe they needed to pretend to be friends, at least for a while. Anna felt her stomach sink. That was definitely the worst mistake I had ever made. Anna Lewis stared at her cell phone screen as if she could burn the headline with the force of her thought. Her name had never appeared in any entertainment news, and it should stay that way. But now, through a quirk of the universe and a series of questionable decisions, here she was, being labeled the mystery woman who supposedly stole former idol John Moore's heart. His stomach dropped as he imagined how many people were reading this, how many obsessed fans were looking for any detail about his identity, and how many journalists might be about to camp out in front of the building. He took a deep breath, trying to hold on to any shred of logic, and asked John how long it would take for it to go away. He pursed his lips, hesitating for a moment before answering that it depended, because some gossip died in 2 days, while others lasted for years. She felt her vision darken slightly. John raised his hands in a pacifying gesture and said that if it was any consolation, at least now they would need to interact in a civilized way so that no one would get suspicious. Anna crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes as she said that he spoke as if it was a benefit to her, when in fact, it was clearly a disgrace. He smiled, leaning against the wall as if this were just a fun mishap, and replied that at least now he had a neighbor to talk to. Anna blinked in disbelief. Did he really think they would become friends because of that mess? The next morning, the building was relatively quiet, with no reporters or fans in sight, and Anna began to believe that perhaps the chaos would disappear faster than she imagined. But that hope only lasted until she opened the door and found a smiling John Moore holding 2 cups of coffee, extending one toward her as if it were a peace offering. He said that since they were neighbors involved in a scandal together, they could at least start the day on a friendly note. She narrowed her eyes, refusing the coffee and saying that she saw no need to interact more than was strictly necessary. He laughed, taking a sip of his own coffee before replying that she could say that, but that the neighbors were already noticing. She frowned, not understanding, until she followed his gaze and realized that, at the end of the corridor, Mrs. Park, the neighbor from 501, was watching them with a curious gleam in her eyes. As soon as she realized she had been noticed, she smiled brightly and waved, before disappearing into the apartment. Anna felt a shiver run down her spine. Nothing escaped that woman's watchful eyes. That night, when Anna was finally able to concentrate on her work and thought she would have some peace, a strong burning smell invaded her apartment. She jumped to her feet, coughing lightly as she ran to open the window. The smell was coming from the hallway. He opened the door only to find John standing in front of his own apartment, desperately fanning the entrance with a towel as a cloud of gray smoke escaped from the kitchen. He looked at her, coughing slightly before giving an awkward smile and saying that perhaps he had miscalculated the timing of an instant noodle. Anna closed her eyes, mentally counting to 5. The next day, he found a package of rice cakes hanging from his door handle, with a scribbled note that said compensation for olfactory damage. Does not contain smoke. She sighed, taking the package and placing it on the kitchen table, convinced that this was the last friendly interaction she would have with him. But then, that same night, he heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. A succession of low knocks, followed by a muffled grunt. He opened the door only to find John sitting on the floor, with an expression of pure defeat. He looked up when he saw her, blinking slowly before saying he locked himself out of his own apartment. Anna took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a second before asking how he accomplished the feat. He scratched the back of his head, explaining that, distracted while talking on the phone, he went out to pick up a package and the door slammed behind him. To make matters worse, his cell phone was inside the apartment. She ran a hand over her face, feeling that, somehow, this was inevitable. He said he needed to call the property manager to get a spare key, but he just sighed, saying that the property manager didn't answer calls after 10 at night. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, Anna pondering whether she should leave him there, sitting in the hallway until dawn. But then something in her conscience stopped her. He huffed, crossing his arms before telling him he could stay on the couch until the problem was resolved the next day. John's eyes widened slightly before he smiled, accepting the offer without hesitation. When Anna threw herself into bed that night, exhausted and convinced that, from now on, her life would never be silent again, John, on the sofa, held a pillow and looked at the ceiling with a small smile. He muttered to himself that he still couldn't believe it. The woman who had sheltered him that night really had no idea who he was. The next morning, Anna Lewis woke up with an unusual feeling. Something was wrong, and it took a few seconds to realize why. His apartment was not silent. The faint sound of someone moving around the room filtered through the half-open door, followed by the muffled sound of whistling and, to his growing horror, the unmistakable aroma of food being prepared. She jumped up on the bed, pulling the blanket against her as if that could protect her from the realization that John Moore was still there. For a moment, she tried to convince herself that maybe he had left early, resolved his problem, and gone away. But then he heard the sound of the microwave beeping, followed by a male voice murmuring contentedly. He got up slowly, walking to the bedroom door and peering at the scene unfolding in his kitchen. John, wearing the same clothes as the day before, but with his hair slightly rumpled, stood in front of the stove, holding a spatula as he stirred something in a frying pan with exaggerated concentration. The smell of eggs and toast filled the air, and the table was already set with 2 plates, 2 cups and a small jar of jam that Anna didn't even remember buying. For a long moment, she just watched, trying to process the completely absurd sight of a man, who just a few days ago was just an insufferable neighbor, now acting like he belonged in her morning routine. John noticed her presence and smiled, pointing at the plates before saying that since she had taken him in, it was only fair that he reciprocate with a decent breakfast. Anna crossed her arms, still trying to understand how her life had gotten to that point, before responding that the best retribution would have been for him to disappear before she woke up. He laughed, ignoring the teasing and placing a portion of eggs on her plate, saying that she should at least try them before deciding to kick him out. Anna sighed, sitting down and taking a piece of toast, more to end that interaction than out of real hunger. But, to his irritating surprise, the food was good. John watched her closely, clearly waiting for a reaction, and when she finally murmured that it was acceptable, he smiled as if he had just won a prize. Later that day, Anna tried to convince herself that breakfast meant nothing and that her routine would return to normal. But then, John started showing up more often. First, it was a casual invitation to grab a coffee at the nearby coffee shop, which she immediately declined, arguing that she preferred her own company. But then he showed up on her doorstep with an extra cup of coffee the next day, saying that since she didn't want to go out, she could at least accept the kindness. Then it was a clumsy attempt to convince her to take a walk in the nearby park, saying that being cooped up in the apartment all day was a waste of fresh air. When she refused, he simply plopped down on the couch next to her, saying that if she didn't want to leave, then he wouldn't leave either. Anna tried to keep her patience intact, ignoring the growing discomfort of his constant presence. But then, one night, when he got up to get a glass of water, he heard a low sound coming from the balcony. The door was ajar, and John was sitting outside, holding a guitar in his lap. The melody he played was soft, different from the unrestrained noise he usually made in his own apartment. There was something almost melancholic in the way her fingers slid across the strings, as if each note carried a weight she didn't understand. She crossed her arms, leaning against the door and asking why he was playing there instead of turning 503 into another makeshift concert arena. He laughed softly before saying he didn't know, but that it seemed easier to touch there. Anna observed for a moment, noticing that, for the first time since she met him, he seemed to be completely absorbed, without his carefree and joking attitude. He was asked why he stopped singing professionally, and he was silent for a few seconds before replying that sometimes, when something you love becomes your job, it ends up losing its appeal. She frowned, sensing there was something more to the answer, something he wasn't saying. But instead of pushing him, she just murmured that at least he could still play without it feeling like an obligation. He looked at her for a moment, and then smiled slightly, saying that, somehow, she always said things in the simplest way, but that, in the end, she always got it right. Anna rolled her eyes, pushing open the door and saying that if he was going to turn her balcony into a personal studio, he should at least learn to play something that suited the silence of the night. But as he returned to bed, with the soft sound of the melody mixing with the night wind, he felt something different. Something new and slightly dangerous. John Moore was becoming a bigger problem than she realized. Anna Lewis's phone kept vibrating. Since waking up that morning, the barrage of notifications had become an irritating nuisance, but it was only when she saw her publisher's name flashing on the screen that she felt a shiver of unease run down her spine. She answered without much patience, already expecting a charge for her next manuscript, but the excited voice on the other end of the line caught her by surprise. The publisher said she had no idea she was dating John Moore, and that it was excellent marketing for her next book. Anna blinked slowly, trying to decipher those words. He asked what she was talking about, and the editor laughed before saying that it was one of the most talked about news stories of the day. How could she hide something so big? The sound of rapid typing filled the call, followed by a brief silence before his editor let out an impressed murmur. He said it was better for Anna to check for herself. With a feeling of dread growing in her chest, Anna took out her cell phone and opened the browser. John's name was among the most talked about topics, and when he clicked on one of the links, he felt his stomach sink. John Moore and his mystery girlfriend. Former Titan idol is officially off the market. The article displayed several photos. Some taken from suspiciously inconvenient angles, like her opening the door for John the night he was locked out of the apartment. Others were even worse, like the one that showed the two of them leaving the building together, when John had insisted on accompanying her to the bookstore days before. But the worst of all was a short video, recorded from a distance, where they were on the balcony of their apartment. She was leaning against the doorframe, and he was playing the guitar. The title of the article suggested that this was a romantic and intimate moment between the couple, as if it were a scene from a carefully rehearsed film. Anna ran a hand over her face, feeling fury bubbling in her throat before she could even process the entire situation. He threw his cell phone on the table and marched to the door, crossing the hallway without hesitation before knocking on 503 hard enough to make the wood vibrate. The door opened almost immediately, and there stood John Moore, messy hair and a baggy sweatshirt, holding a bowl of cereal like he was in the middle of a lazy breakfast. He smiled when he saw her and asked if she had already seen the news, because he had just read it and, honestly, thought they made a visually interesting couple. Anna squinted her eyes, trying to decide whether to strangle him right then and there or waste time screaming before doing so. He asked how he could be so calm, because if he hadn't noticed, his life was officially ruined. John raised an eyebrow, chewing absent-mindedly as he said that maybe she was exaggerating, because it wasn't like the news would hurt her. Anna felt the vein in her temple throb. She said she was a reclusive writer and now, thanks to him, her privacy was completely destroyed. He was asked if he had any idea how many obsessed fans and insistent journalists might be about to surround the building. John tilted his head, considering the possibility with almost amused interest, and said that now that she mentioned it, it might be a good idea to avoid going out alone for a while. She laughed humorlessly, running her hands through her hair before saying that this couldn't be happening. John then set the bowl of cereal down on the table next to the door and looked at her with what appeared to be a trace of regret. She said she understood this was a problem for her, but the good news was that in a few weeks people would lose interest and move on to another piece of gossip. She stared at him for a long moment, trying to find any sign that he actually took this mess seriously, but all she saw was the same irritating confidence that seemed to be part of his identity. He took a deep breath, trying to regain control of his patience, and said that if he really wanted to make it up to her for this mess, then he would make an effort to keep his distance. He said that, from that moment on, any interaction between them should be minimal, because the more time they spent together, the more fuel they would give to the rumors. John crossed his arms, leaning casually against the doorframe, and asked if that meant she didn't want his breakfasts anymore. She narrowed her eyes and said that from now on, he was a neighbor like any other, and that the last thing she needed was to continue feeding a false romance narrative. He laughed softly, as if he found her determination charming, and said it was okay, he would respect her decision. But as soon as Anna turned to leave, he called her back and asked if she wanted to know an interesting fact. Anna stopped, crossing her arms and rolling her eyes before saying no, she didn't want to know. But he continued anyway, saying that he found it fascinating how she really didn't know anything about him. She said that anyone else in her position would have been excited to be linked to John Moore, but that she, on the other hand, seemed to hate every second of it. She sighed and said the problem wasn't him specifically, but rather the fact that his name was in a headline that shouldn't exist. John smirked, his eyes shining with something indefinable, before saying that he had never met anyone like her before, and that made everything so much more interesting. Anna felt a shiver run down her spine, but she ignored the sensation and left his apartment without looking back. But as she closed the door to her own apartment, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that John not only wasn't worried about the whole mess, but was somehow enjoying it. Anna Lewis thought that the chaos had already reached its peak. She thought that nothing could be worse than waking up and seeing her name in a ridiculous headline, than being approached by strangers on the street asking about a relationship that didn't exist, than having her meticulously built piece fall apart because of an inconvenient neighbor. But then, one gray, damp morning, when she mindlessly opened the news app, she realized she was wrong. The headline was different from the one that had gone viral days before. "I didn't talk about her. He talked about him." John Moore and the scandal that destroyed his career, ex-Titan leader breaks silence after 3 years in prison. The coffee he was holding slipped from his fingers, spilling across the table as his eyes ran over the article. Paragraphs and paragraphs recounted a scandal that she was completely unaware of, sensationalist phrases reconstructing a cloudy past. Rumors of betrayal between group members, disagreements with the company, broken contracts, an alleged fight behind the scenes that was never explained. Words like controversial, troubled, and millionaire scandal leapt off the screen like sharp shrapnel, painting a completely different portrait of the carefree man who invaded her life like a noisy hurricane. Anna put her cell phone away and massaged her temples, feeling her confusion slowly turn into irritation. Of all the things that could go wrong, she was now involved with someone who carried a shadow that clearly hadn't been resolved. But before he could decide what to do, a new sound invaded the apartment. Hurried knocks on the door, urgent enough to make her get up on impulse. When she opened it, she found John standing there, out of breath, as if he had been running to get to her. But this time, there was no teasing smile on his face, no ready joke. He looked different. She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes before saying that she imagined he would come. He let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair and asking if she had seen the news yet. She nodded slowly before asking what exactly was going on and why it suddenly felt like her life was about to become even more complicated. John hesitated for a moment, eyes roaming the floor as if trying to find the right words. Then he said that was the past he was trying to leave behind. He said that, 3 years ago, his departure from Titan was not just a friendly goodbye to the music industry, as everyone believed. There was a story behind it, a story he never wanted to tell. Anna waited, without interrupting him, while he took a deep breath before continuing. He said that, at the time he was still in the group, the pressures of the company and fame were destroying his sanity. He said that the contracts were suffocating, that the exhausting routine and the lack of control over his own life were pushing him to the limit. But the last straw came when he discovered that one of the members was being forced to remain in the group against his will, threatened by the record company to maintain a perfect image for the fans. John confronted the businesspeople, said that this was unacceptable, that no one should be treated like property. But instead of solving the problem, they turned the situation against him. They spread rumors that he had betrayed his colleagues, manipulated information, and turned his fans against him. In the end, he was forced to leave, alone and branded as ungrateful. Anna watched him in silence, trying to process everything she had just heard. He was standing there, in front of her, visibly tense, as if he was waiting for a reaction that never came. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. He said it was the first time he told someone the truth. He said he spent the last few years trying to disappear, hoping that over time people would forget. But now, with the media digging back into the past, he didn't know if it was still possible to escape. She ran a hand over her face, feeling unexpectedly tired. She said that it had nothing to do with her, that she was not part of this story. But John just smiled bitterly before saying that, unfortunately, she was now involved. He said that since news about their alleged relationship started circulating, people were connecting the dots. Journalists started asking who she was, why he was hiding in the apartment next to her, what it meant. And, more importantly, they began to question whether this was the reason he had walked away from music. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find a thread of logic in the chaos. When he spoke again, his voice was colder than he intended. He asked if he had any idea how to resolve this or if he just intended to continue pretending that nothing was happening. John lowered his head for a moment, before looking up and saying he didn't know. He said that, as much as he wanted to believe it would go away with time, part of him knew there was no way to escape it anymore. Anna watched him for a long moment before saying that if he wanted to face this, he needed to start telling his story for real. He laughed softly, humorlessly, before asking if she thought anyone would actually care about the truth. She shrugged and replied that he would never know if he didn't try. John stared at her for a moment, as if he were considering something he didn't even understand. Then he smiled slightly, but this time, there was no amusement on his face. Just something deeper, more uncertain. He said maybe it was time to stop running. Anna Lewis felt that her patience was at its limit. Throughout the week, his routine had been invaded by insistent phone calls from the publisher, messages from strangers on his social networks and camera flashes every time he left the house. The building, once a silent refuge, now seemed like a war zone, with reporters hiding in every corner and neighbors whispering about the alleged relationship between her and John Moore. But the worst of all wasn't the external noise. The worst of all was his presence. John Moore continued to act as if nothing was happening. Even after the articles resurrected his past scandal, even after his name became one of the most talked about on the internet again, he still walked around the building with the same irritating nonchalance, as if he wasn't dragging Anna into the eye of a hurricane she never wanted to enter. And the most unbearable thing was that, somehow, he seemed to feel comfortable in the middle of the chaos. As if part of him had missed the attention, as if, deep down, he liked being in the spotlight again. That night, when she finally thought she would have a few hours of peace, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the apartment. Her heart sank instantly. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. He knew it would be John, with his easy smile and carefree expression, probably coming up with some absurd idea that would only make his situation worse. But for some reason, he opened the door anyway. He was there, dressed in sweats and jeans, holding 2 cups of hot tea. He handed one of them towards her and said that, after everything that had happened, she seemed to need something to relax. She laughed humorlessly, crossing her arms before saying that if he really wanted to help her, he should just disappear from her life. His smile faltered, just for a moment. But it soon returned, smaller than before. He asked if she was serious. Anna felt her fingers involuntarily press against her arms. She said that since he arrived, everything she built has fallen apart. He said he never wanted to be in the headlines, he never wanted to deal with paparazzi, he never wanted to have his name tied to his. He said his life was peaceful before he showed up, and now everything was out of control. John remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on her as if he were trying to absorb every word. Then he took a step forward, lowering his voice before asking if that was really what she thought. He asked her if, deep down, she thought he was just a problem, a mistake that should never have happened. Anna opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated. Something in his gaze made her feel a weight in her chest, a tightness she couldn't explain. But I was tired. Tired of having your life invaded, tired of dealing with something you never asked for. I said yes. He said it would be better if they had never met. The silence that followed was unbearable. John just stood there, motionless, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Then, without another word, he took a step back. He left the glass of tea on the table next to the door, turned and left. Anna stood there, watching him walk away down the corridor, feeling a strange emptiness settle inside her. But he didn't call him back. Not that night. Anna Lewis thought she would feel relief. When John Moore left her apartment that night without looking back, when the sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway and the door to 503 closed with a dull click, she thought she would finally have her peace back. But the days passed, and the silence that was once his greatest source of comfort now felt too heavy. It wasn't the kind of silence she loved, the kind that filled her writing moments and made the world less suffocating. It was a different, dense, strange silence. A silence that seemed to creep into every corner of the apartment, reminding her that something had changed. The apartment next door was dark every night. No music escaped through the walls, no sound of guitar invaded her routine, no hoarse voice singing out of tune made her roll her eyes in exasperation. It was as if John had evaporated. No knocking on the door, no annoying attempts to start a conversation. Just an emptiness that she refused to name. She tried to ignore it. He immersed himself in his work as he always did, writing for hours on end, letting his fingers run across the keyboard until his mind was too exhausted to think about anything else. But then one afternoon, while reviewing a chapter, he noticed something strange. The main character of his new novel, a protagonist he had created months before John came into his life, now sounded different. His speeches had a more carefree tone, a lightness that wasn't there before. His way of speaking, his way of teasing the protagonist, the way he always seemed to find an opening to smile, even in the most serious moments. Anna took her hands away from the keyboard, feeling her heart beat a little faster when she realized what had happened. John had infiltrated her words, her writing, her world. Without even realizing it, she had absorbed part of it. He let out a frustrated sigh and got up, walking to the balcony. The cold night wind blew against his face, but it wasn't enough to dispel his uneasiness. He looked at the apartment next door, at the glass door that was always open before, with John sitting there, playing the guitar as if the world wasn't falling apart around him. Now the porch was empty, the lights were off, the space was completely dead. The next day, when she left to go to the bookstore, she passed the building's caretaker, who greeted her politely before asking if her friend had traveled. Anna frowned, surprised by the question, before answering that she didn't know. The man shrugged, explaining that John had left a few days ago and hadn't returned. She felt her chest tighten. Meanwhile, across town, John Moore sat in a small makeshift studio, surrounded by cables, headphones, and sheet music spread out on the table. The sound of his own voice echoed through the speakers, mixing with the soft beats of a new melody. But despite all the structure around him, despite the microphone in front of him and the recorder ready to capture every note, he couldn't sing. It was strange. For years, he avoided all that. He avoided studios, he avoided unfinished compositions, he avoided the need to think about music in a professional way. But now that he had finally decided to return, that he had finally decided to face his past, it felt like something was missing. Something that made him hesitate before opening his mouth to sing the first line. Something that made everything more difficult. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment before letting out a low, humorless laugh. He told himself it was pathetic. He said it didn't make sense. But then, unintentionally, his mind betrayed him. He visualized an apartment lit by a warm light, a messy table with a notebook always open, a face with a stubbornly closed expression, but with eyes that said more than any words. Anna Lewis. John let out a sigh and ran his hands through his hair, feeling the weight of distance pile up on his shoulders. He realized, with irritating clarity, that she had become part of his life in a way he hadn't expected. He realized that even if he tried to focus on anything else, her absence was present in everything. And more than anything, he realized he was tired of running. That night, Anna Lewis tried to ignore the restlessness that had settled inside her. He tried to focus on the manuscript open in front of him, on the words that kept mixing together, on the cursor blinking impatiently as if mocking his inability to concentrate. She tried to ignore the emptiness of the apartment next door, the silence that, instead of comforting her, seemed to resonate inside her like an echo. But when the doorbell rang, breaking the stillness abruptly, she knew. His heart raced before he even got up. Each step toward the door seemed to weigh more than it should, and for a second, she hesitated. Then, he took a deep breath and opened it. John Moore was there, standing in the hallway as if he had never left, but at the same time, different. His eyes seemed more serious, more resolute, as if something inside him had reorganized itself during the time they were apart. He looked at her for a moment too long before saying that he had realized something important while he was gone. He said he spent years trying to get away from everything, the music, the past, the complications. He said he believed silence was the only way to protect himself. But then he met an annoyingly antisocial neighbor who just wanted peace and, ironically, ended up bringing chaos into his life. Anna crossed her arms, feeling her chest tighten in a way she didn't want to admit. He said that if he had come here just to provoke, he should leave. But John chuckled softly, shaking his head before saying that, for once, he wasn't joking. He said he realized something when he was away from her, and now he needed to say it anyway. She blinked, feeling a strange shiver run down her spine. But before she could respond, he took a step away and, to her utter horror, took a deep breath and began to sing. There. In the hallway. Loud and clear. Anna's eyes widened as John released his voice with dramatic intensity, extending his arms as if he were on an imaginary stage. The melody was an exaggerated ballad, and the lyrics, which he was clearly making up at the time, were about a man who was rejected by a cold woman, but who still came back because he couldn't live without her. Anna felt her soul leave her body when a door opened at the end of the corridor and Mrs. Park appeared, observing the scene with a sparkle of interest in her eyes. Another neighbor peeked in from upstairs. Another door creaked, someone coughed discreetly. She rushed forward on impulse, grabbing John's wrist and pulling him into the apartment before he decided to add an improvised instrumental bridge. When he closed the door behind them, he leaned against it, covering his face with his hands before muttering that he had to be crazy. John laughed, eyes shining with amusement and something deeper. He said he knew he needed to do something big, because it was the only way to truly capture her attention. Anna took a deep breath, crossing her arms before asking if he really expected her to accept that, to simply ignore all the chaos he brought into her life. John was silent for a moment before saying that he never wanted to make things complicated for her, but that deep down, he never regretted meeting her. He said she was the first person who looked at him without seeing a former idol, without seeing a scandal, without seeing a headline. And that, as annoying as she was, he liked it. Anna felt her chest tighten again. She tried to find an answer, anything that would make him stop looking at her like that, as if he were waiting for something important. But then, in a lower tone, he said that he didn't know exactly when it happened, but that at some point between the fights, the breakfasts and the late nights on the porch, he started to like her. She looked away, feeling the words catch in her throat. Said he was unbearable. He said his life was better before him. But then, in a barely audible whisper, she admitted that she now felt empty without him. John smiled slowly, as if he knew that was the only answer he needed. The next morning, neighbors were whispering about the scene in the hallway. Mrs. Park commented that she had seen something very interesting the night before, and John Moore's name was still trending on the internet. But Anna decided she didn't care anymore. Because now, when she sat down to write, there were no more blocks. When he looked to the side, there was no longer heavy silence. When the doorbell rang, she knew it was him, and she knew he would open the door. After all, as irritating as it was to admit, John Moore was already part of her life. And somehow, she liked that. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Happiness of Love. That way, you won't miss any of our heartfelt romances. See you in the next love story.